Final recipe begins with a professional chef specializing in traditional Chinese cuisine named Pao, whose dish is well known for its wonderful taste. However, due to Hao's conservative and unpleasant disposition, his restaurant gradually began to empty and was abandoned by customers, bringing it close to bankruptcy. Hao was experiencing financial troubles and had fallen behind on his land fee for 8 months. He has a grandson named Mark, a young man who shares his grandfather's cooking aptitude. Nonetheless, Hao hopes that his grandson will be able to finish his education through college and become an engineer. One day, as Mark was reading a food magazine, his grandfather became ill and had to be brought to the hospital. Mrs. Wang, one of Hao's most faithful assistants, informed Mark that his grandfather became ill from shock after discovering that his restaurant might close shortly if he could not pay off his debt. When Mark heard this, he was resolved to raise funds to help his grandfather pay off all of his bills and save his business from bankruptcy. At the same time, Mark watched a television program hosted by his idol, David Chen, a well-known chef. During the ceremony, David announced a cooking competition in Shanghai, with the winner receiving $1 million. Mark was determined to enter the competition and win. He then drew out all of his savings to pay for the trip to Shanghai. Mrs. Wang seemed concerned as she noticed that Hao did not want his grandson to be a chef. But Mark tried to persuade Mrs. Wang by claiming that he did all of this to assist his grandfather salvage their restaurant from bankruptcy. Mrs. Wang eventually gave up. She even offered Mark some money for expenses and supplies while in Shanghai. Mark was overjoyed in hunger. Long story short, Mark arrived in Shanghai. He tried a variety of street food that is well known in Shanghai. However, it caused him to lose track of time, and he was late for the audition, held before the cooking competition began. Mark rushed to the audition location, but when he arrived, registration for the audition had closed. Disappointed, he nearly gave up until, in the end, he replaced Dimitri, a participant who did not show up. Mark was finally able to audition, and the competitors were requested to cook an omelette, a basic dish, but the omelette had to be excellent. Mark encountered a dilemma since the stove was not working. He didn't run out of ideas and started a fire by burning the paper he was carrying. Mark was able to cook an omelette on time, and the results were excellent, till he was considered to have passed his audition. In the next level, the participants would be divided into groups of 4, with only 4 groups passing and moving on to the next stage. Mark was drawn into a group of 8, which included a lovely Japanese woman named Kaori, an Australian named Seen, and a South Korean named Park. In this round, the players were instructed to process pork. The other groups appeared to work well together when processing food items, but Mark's team frequently clashed because Kaori was hesitant to accept suggestions and opinions from her team members. When their meals were served, Kaori insisted on adding her own sauce. However, after tasting their dish, Mark concluded that Kaori did not need to add sauce because their cooking was already great, and Seen and Park agreed with him. However, Kaori persevered, and when Mark attempted to stop her, she accidentally splashed hot sauce on his hand. After the cooking time was up, the judges began sampling and scoring the foods prepared by the participants. When the judges tried Mark's team's cuisine, they were initially unimpressed because their dish was rather simple. But after tasting it, they were surprised because it turned out to be quite delicious, and the texture of the meat was extremely appropriate. Mark's squad was officially qualified for the following round. After the competition, one of the judges, Julia Lee, saw a crowd at the competition area. She dashed over to the crowd and discovered that everyone had gathered and was dining together. Mark acted as a chef since he felt bad if the food ingredients that were not used were eventually discarded by the committee. As a result of his participation in the cooking competition, he took the initiative to process these ingredients and prepare meals for the hungry participants. He also offered Juliet his cooking. Julia was brought back to her childhood memories after tasting Mark's food. Julia was tasked at the time with finding a dependable chef to appear as a guest star on the television show she hosted. She visited numerous locations and tried every food, but nothing satisfied her appetite. Until one day, she noticed a really appealing aroma of cooking emanating from the kitchen of a closed restaurant. When she stepped inside, she encountered a widower named David, who had prepared a lunch for his son. David then asked Julia to try his cuisine, which was fantastic. Julia and David became closer over time and eventually married. Because Mark's cuisine reminded Julia of David's culinary, which she had eaten several years ago, Julia directed one of her subordinates to look into Mark's past, who used Dimitri's name during the cooking competition. Not only that, but Julia had also urged her colleagues to hunt for the whereabouts of David's missing kid, after receiving information that the boy might be in Singapore. On the other hand, Hao, who had completed his critical spell in the hospital, received a call from Mark informing him that he was on a study tour and asked his grandfather not to worry about him. In the next round, each group was given 4 hours to shop for groceries, with money allocated by the committee. As usual, Corey and Scene were constantly disputing over everything, and they ended up disagreeing and buying their own groceries. Meanwhile, Park offered to Mark that they'd take the money and utilize it for their personal gain because he didn't think they would win the competition. Mark was tempted to use the money to pay off his grandfather's debt and rushed to the airport. However, while in the waiting area, Mark saw his idol, David Chen, on television, explaining his life story, from starting out as a chef in a modest restaurant to eventually being a master chef who is well known today. After hearing David Chen's amazing narrative, he decided not to take the money and return to the competition location. When he arrived, he discovered Scene and Corey in a heated dispute, which escalated into an event in which Corey was nearly injured if Scene had not saved her. As a result of the incident, Mark's team's kitchen became a disaster, spilling all of their food. With little time left, Mark instructed his staff to prepare a dish utilizing the remaining components. At the same time, Park returned, having spent his money on fancy items. Following the incident, Mark's team was able to collaborate effectively, including Corey, who began listening to her team members' comments and opinions. Unlike other groups who created excellent foods with a distinct and elegant appearance, Mark's team created basic dishes that are commonly consumed on a daily basis. However, when the judges added Mark's sauce to their dish, they were equally amazed by his team's ability to transform a simple dish into a great dish. However, in this round, the judges took into account not only the flavor of the food and the aesthetic value of the dishes, but also how much money the players spent on groceries. The judges ultimately decided Mark's team as the winner since Mark still had money that he had not used at all, whilst the other groups had spent the shopping money granted by the committee. Long story short, Mark and his team advanced to the following stage, where they had to compete with each other in crafting noodle dishes. Park, Scene, and Corey instantly prepared their unique noodle dish, while Mark was pensive for a minute as he remembered his father making dumplings. Following that, he was inspired to create a unique noodle dish. When it came time for the assessment, Julia served as the single judge, evaluating each participant's dish. Park tried a variety of flavored noodles but failed due to the unusual taste. Scene prepared chicken noodles without gravy, but he also failed since Julia discovered a hair in the dish. Corey prepared ramen noodles, however she was labeled a failure because she did not provide the judges with chopsticks. Julia saw no noodle dish on Mark's table, since he cooked dumplings with noodles as the base element. Because it was regarded innovative and tasted wonderful, Julia declared Mark the winner of this round, and he earned the privilege to fight in the final round against the master chef, David Chen. After the competition, Julia received word from her men in Moscow, where she met the genuine Dmitri, who had not participated in the cookery competition. Julia recalled the quarrel between David and his father as she watched Mark celebrate his triumph with his buddies. At the time, David's father was opposed to David's participation in a cooking competition. However, David persisted in competing in the culinary competition until he was crowned winner, and his career as a dependable chef began to grow. One day, a fire broke out in the kitchen of David's father's restaurant, and David's kid was observed attempting to put it out. David's father then attempted to reach David, but Julia was unable to inform him because he was on a live cookery show. David's father, angry and disappointed, told him that he no longer regarded him as son and did not want to see him again. After learning that his business was on fire, David went there but was unable to locate his father. In addition, he was horrified to find that his son had died in the tragedy. Turning to the present, Julia, who already knows where David's father is, arrives at the hospital to meet him. It turned out that David's father was Hao, and when the old man saw Julia, he instantly booted her out since he still despised Julia for all that had occurred to him and his son. As Hao was about to flee Julia, the elderly man entered a room and noticed Mark conducting an interview on television. Knowing that his grandchild was following in his son's footsteps made Hao sad and unhappy, especially since Mark had lied to him. Julia then approached Hao and tried to explain everything. She stated that in the final round, Mark will face David Chen, his biological father. But Hao continued to chase Julia away. Knowing Mark's true identity, Julia summoned him to her room. Julia did not appear to mind Mark's fake of identity. She even told Mark everything and revealed that David Chen was his father. Mark, who couldn't accept this fact, believed David had deserted him on purpose. Mark was furious since his grandfather had also hidden the fact that his father was still alive. Even though he tried to explain that he was forced to do it for Mark's sake, he also hated Mark for lying to him. Even nevertheless, Mark defended himself, claiming that he entered a cooking competition to save their restaurant from bankruptcy. The next day, Julia received word that Mark had left the hotel. Hearing this, she instantly looked for Mark and was able to locate him by smelling the aroma of his cooking. Julia told Mark that David didn't know the truth since Hal kept it from him and David. Julia told Mark before departing that only he could resolve their family's disagreement. After hearing Julia's explanation, Mark finally understood and decided to rejoin the competition. The final round eventually began, with Mark against David Chen. On this occasion, Julia purposefully modified the cooking concept, which was originally Asian, into a dish of family love. Mark and David began the competition by demonstrating one another's inventiveness and culinary abilities. David prepared 15 different foods that looked appealing. He mentioned that he and his son will prepare a special dish together for his son's birthday. David had prepared 15 dishes on purpose because he had missed his son's 15th birthday. The judges was moved to hear David's story about how much he loved his son. When it was Mark's turn to be judged, the judges appeared normal because Mark had only prepared one simple noodle dish. But Mark explained that the dish he prepared was for David and invited him to sample it. David, perplexed by this, was then shocked by the entrance of his father, who instructed him to try his son's cuisine, which was none other than Mark. Hal apologized to David and Mark for keeping a major secret from them. David and Mark were overcome with emotion as they realized they could finally be together. The poignant moment between father and son, who had been separated for a long time but were brought together by food, was also televised across the country. Hal thanked Julia for letting him repair his faults. The film concludes with Corey, Sean, and Park, who have lived their own lives. Mark has realized his dream of becoming a chef and now manages his late grandfather's restaurant. At the end of his life, Hal was finally able to mend his faults and reunite with his family after such a lengthy separation. It's an incredibly amazing and moving film. Through the role of Mark, we are encouraged to be bold and never give up on our aspirations, even if our grandfather opposes them. On the other hand, despite believing that his son had died, David always remembered and loved him.